Revolutionary greetings, comrades. We hope you are okay wherever you are. Zimbabwe is going to elections next year. We are not sure of the month, but in 2023, it's harmonized elections. A lot of people are pinning their hopes on the 2023 elections. Some are calling them historical elections. But the question we must ask ourselves is, since 1980, what has the election done for the people of Zimbabwe? Have the people of Zimbabwe lives changed in every 5 years when elections are held? And these elections are normally held under what conditions? What did we achieve in the 2018 elections, in the 2013 elections, in the 2008 elections, in the 2002 elections, or 2002, 2005 elections, 1990 elections? We can go on and ask these questions. What changed after these elections? Post-elections in 2023, are we not going to find ourselves in a similar situation where we pin our hopes to the 2028 elections? And the elections, are they the answer in resolving our crisis? This is the question that all of us, we must engage on. We are not by any means suggesting that elections are not important and that we should not participate in the electoral process. We must participate if conditions allow in the electoral process. But we must put it forward that elections under the current conditions are not the answer to resolving our economic and political crisis. It doesn't matter who emerges as the winner, because the two main parties that are likely to form a government post-elections have similar economic policies. What might change is the face of individuals, the name of a party that is governing, but nothing will change in terms of the lives of the working people of Zimbabwe. So I want to argue that Zimbabwe will not resolve its issues through an electoral process in the manner in which it is designed currently, or has been designed since 1980, because the election outcome always favors the ruling class. And Karl Marx made this observation that after every 5 years, we are forced to elect a representative of the ruling class who's going to oppress us for the next 5 years. And this is true of Zimbabwe and true of a number of African countries. What Zimbabwe needs is a revolution, a socialist revolution. We need to be very clear. We don't just need a revolution in Zimbabwe. We need a socialist revolution. But for us to be able to carry out this revolutionary task, we must organize ourselves. Because a revolution cannot just happen. A revolution needs us to engineer it. But how do we get to engineer a socialist revolution? In any case, what is a revolution? We need to replace the current political system, political and economic system, and bring a new order in Zimbabwe. And this order, we define it as a socialist economic order. This is what a socialist revolution must achieve. Lenin wrote extensively in one of his works in 1902, what is to be done. There's a section where he dealt with this question, where he spoke of organization of workers and organization of revolutionaries. Because a revolution cannot be carried out if workers and the revolutionaries are not organized. It's important to make this distinction. We are saying workers and revolutionaries because in many times we confuse our trade unions and characterize them as revolutionary trade unions. Trade unions are progressive. Yes, we have liberal trade unions, reactionary trade unions, and so forth. But trade unions in their nature, they are not revolutionary. They are progressive. Because what preoccupies a trade unionist is issues relating to the working conditions of a worker, the wages of a worker, and so forth. A trade union does not seek to overthrow the ruling class. But the trade union works with the revolutionaries to overthrow the ruling class. Trade unions on their own will not overthrow the ruling class. That's not their mandate. And they will not do so. This is why in a number of countries, even in Zimbabwe, when trade unions or trade unionists decide to establish a mass political movement to contest an election, they quickly get co-opted into the system and they abandon the struggle of the working class. We have discussed what Chiluba did in Zambia. We have discussed our own Morgan Tsvangirai in Zimbabwe and the other trade unions. We have discussed the same Shilowa in South Africa and the other trade unions. So a trade union is not revolutionary. It's important to make this point because if we do not make this point, that a trade union is not revolutionary, we are going to commit a suicide. So Lenin wrote in What is to be Done, spoke about organization of workers and organizations and an organization of revolutionaries. At the time when Comrade Lenin was writing in 1902, if you read this article or his thesis, he uses the word social democrats. And they will know that many political formations, for instance, the movement for democratic change, was characterized or defined as a social democrat. And I want to point out that when Lenin uses the word social democrats, he meant Marxist. So he did not mean the social democrats that we know today, because today we are told that social democrats, you need to get a balance, a middle ground. You borrow from capitalism, you borrow from socialist principles, and build an economy based what you borrow from both. This is not what Lenin meant. We know that when he was writing in 1902, he was leading the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was Marxist. And we also know that the German Social Democratic Party was a Marxist. So it was only in 1918 that to revert back to the term communist, as was used by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. So if you read the Communist Manifesto, it's clear where it talks about communists. But when you read here, so that our comrades don't get confused, Lenin uses social democrats. So in the place of social democrats, you simply substitute with the communists for you to have a better understanding on what Lenin was saying. So if Zimbabwe needs a revolution, of which we argue that indeed Zimbabwe needs a revolution, and we are saying a revolution cannot just happen on its own. We must be organized. It means we must organize trade unions. We must organize the party to lead the socialist revolution. And I quote where Lenin here says, that's the chapter that deals with organization of workers and organization of revolutionaries in what is to be done. Lenin says, I quote, "The workers' organization must, in the first place, be a trade union organization." This is key. The workers' organization must, in the first place, be a trade union organization. Secondly, it must be as broad as possible. And thirdly, it must be as public as condition will allow. Of course, when Comrade Lenin was writing, trade unions were not allowed in Russia. Political parties were not allowed in Russia. And one quickly thinks of Eswatini, where it is difficult to organize workers. Parties remained banned in Swaziland. One might argue and say the conditions that obtained in Russia before the revolution under Nicholas Tsar II are the same conditions to a certain extent that are prevailing in Swaziland today under the Tinkudla system as led by Mswati III. But what is key, which Lenin speaks to, is that the workers' organization must, in the first place, be a trade union organization. Secondly, it must be as broad as possible. And broad as possible, in the last video, we spoke that in trade unions, we do not recruit only those workers that might agree with us. It must be as broad as possible. We must recruit in the trade unions those that are even advancing the restoration agenda in Mtwagas. So every worker, be a Mtwagas activist who's a worker, as an PF member, I know that one comrade, when I said let's recruit, trade unions must be as broad as possible. Have ZANU PF, Triple C, everyone in the trade union, workers. One comrade thought I was out of order. But this is what Lenin says in what is to be done, organization of workers and organization of revolutionaries. That a trade union must be as broad as possible. Once a trade union is as broad as possible, it is our revolutionary task to raise the class consciousness of every worker in the trade union. Because you cannot just be class conscious, or your class consciousness cannot just be raised before you even join a trade union or by merely joining a trade union. This is why it is key that in our case, in the Zimbabwe Communist Party, we must intensify political education in every trade union organization in Zimbabwe if we are to lead a socialist revolution. Because workers in Zimbabwe cannot put their faith in the Triple C, in the Chamisa Chete Chete slogan. It cannot be. But in the reality, this is what is currently happening. That workers in Zimbabwe think that if ZANU-PF is defeated and Triple C wins led by Chamisa, all their problems are gone. No. So this is why it is key that first and foremost, if we are to lead a socialist revolution in Zimbabwe, which by the way, this is what it needs, because Zimbabwe needs a revolution. Because an election will not resolve the crisis that we are faced with. So the trade union the workers must organize themselves into a trade union organization. That trade union must be as broad as possible, and thirdly, it must be as public as conditions will allow. On the other hand, Lenin writes, the organization of revolutionaries must consist first and foremost of people who make revolutionary activity their profession. Right? We always talk of a vanguard, that you are building a vanguard of the working class and the rural people. One comrade, we will engage on this question. One comrade on Twitter said, no, we're no longer calling anyone peasants, but we will engage later on this question. So before we engage on that question, which the comrade is raising on Twitter, I will use the rural populace in substitute for the peasants until we engage on this question. Now, the organization of the revolutionaries, this is the party, in our case, the Zimbabwe Communist Party, must consist first and foremost of people who make revolutionary activity their profession. That's what every communist must do. A communist must not be a reformist. A communist must, at all times, concentrate on the overthrow of the capitalist system. Because it is only when we overthrow the capitalist system and usher in socialism, a socialist economy, that the workers will begin to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Because under a capitalist system, yes, we'll be arguing for better wages, for better working conditions. We'll be negotiating. We sit on the table with the employers. That's what a trade union does. In any case, the employer would say, no, we'll give you 7%. The leaders of the trade union say, no, 113%. You have to enter into negotiations. And one principle in negotiations is that when you enter into negotiations, so the principle is you must be prepared to compromise. When you go to negotiate, the moment you sit on the negotiating table, you have to compromise. So when you are a trade union leader going into the negotiations for a salary increase, and you are demanding 25%, and the employer says 7%, you will end up accepting 11% because you have to negotiate. But the duty of revolutionaries, the revolutionary duty of a party is to lead, not into reforming the capitalist state. That's not our task, to reform the capitalist state. Our task is to overthrow the capitalist state and transit into a socialist economy. That's our task. So Lenin writes, the workers' organization for the economic struggle should be trade union organizations, because the trade unions in their nature are engaged in an economic struggle on daily basis. Better working conditions, because basic commodities are up, workers must be paid in line with the inflation, whatever, and so forth. That's what a trade union does. But it must be progressive. Progressive, in the last video we said, it is the task of the trade union movement to build the party. I'm moving to conclusion. As I move to conclusion, I want to conclude by saying that we are not in any way suggesting that people should not participate in elections. No. But we are saying our revolutionary task is to overthrow the capitalist system. Because changing ZANU-PF as a political party and replacing it with the triple C is not enough. Yes, people will celebrate as we celebrated in 2017 when the Bond coup happened, celebrating the departure of Mugabe. But nothing changed. Yes, people will celebrate a triple C victory in 2023 if it happens. But few months down the line, they will begin to say, no, nothing has changed. We celebrated in 1980. Today, people argue that it was better under Ian Smith. In South Africa, people celebrated in 1994. Today, they argue that it was better under apartheid regime. So, the only way we can change society or transform society, it is through a socialist revolution. And this is what Zimbabwe currently needs. And Lenin says, as I conclude, every social democrat here will replace with the communist, as I explained. So I will read it with this correction. Every communist worker should, as far as possible, assist and actively work in these organizations. Let me maybe start from the first line. The workers' organizations for the economic struggle should be trade union organizations. Every communist, though Lenin wrote social democratic, worker should, as far as possible, assist and actively work in these organizations. But while this is true, it is certainly not in our interest to demand that only social democrats, in place communists, should be eligible for membership in the trade unions, since that would only narrow the scope of our influence upon the masses. I've already addressed this question, that the trade union must be as broad as possible. It must not discriminate at the workplace when organizing workers. Let every worker who understands the need to unite for the struggle against the employers and the government join the trade unions. Because the struggle of the workers is a struggle against the employer. The very aim of the trade unions would be impossible of achievement if they did not unite all who have attained at least this elementary degree of understanding. If they were not very broad organizations, the broader these organizations, the broader will be our influence over them, and influence not only to the spontaneous development of the economic struggle, but to the direct and conscious effort of the socialist trade union members to influence their comrades. So, I'm concluding now. Our trade unions must be as broad as possible. The Zimbabwe Communist Party, must be made up of comrades, first and foremost, who understand Marxist-Leninist theory. Must be comrades that make the revolutionary activity, take it seriously as a full-time job. If we are to lead a socialist revolution in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe needs a socialist revolution. It is only the Zimbabwe Communist Party, other left formations, and the workers that must lead the socialist revolution. But if we don't, reactionaries and liberals will continue to reform the state and will continue putting our hopes and a faith in the next election after 5 years. Many people believe that change is going to come in 2023. After 2023, they will say change is going to come in 2028. Another 5 years, another 5 years, another 5 years. This must come to an end. Zimbabwe is ripe for a socialist revolution. The Zimbabwe Communist Party, and the workers must lead and transform our society. Please circulate this video. Let's hear your comments. Otherwise, subscribe to this YouTube channel. Amandla, comrades.